Is evil an external force, a malevolent entity lurking in the shadows, waiting to tempt and corrupt? Or is it a deeply human phenomenon, a potential within each of us, shaped by psychology, circumstance, and spiritual choices? Across millennia and cultures, humanity has grappled with the nature of destructive acts, personifying them in figures like Satan, Mara, Iblis, or the myriad demons and tricksters of indigenous lore. These archetypal representations, often called the devil, serve as powerful symbols for the darkness we perceive both in the world and within the human heart. They are not merely ancient myths, they are profound psychological and spiritual metaphors that continue to resonate, challenging us to confront the origins and perpetuation of suffering. This essay posits that the devil archetype serves as a profound and multifaceted lens through which to examine the psychology of evil. By integrating clinical understanding of destructive human behavior with spiritual wisdom on inner darkness and the quest for wholeness, we can move beyond simplistic explanations. We will explore how this universal archetype illuminates the mechanisms of dehumanization, the allure of power, the seductions of the ego, and the profound capacity for cruelty that resides within the human psyche. Simultaneously, we will delve into how spiritual traditions have understood, confronted, and sought to transcend this inner and outer darkness, offering pathways not just to intellectual comprehension, but to genuine transformation. Our exploration will draw from a rich tapestry of psychological frameworks, including Jungian analytical psychology and the concept of the shadow, social psychology's insights into group dynamics and obedience, cognitive psychology's examination of biases and self-deception, and clinical psychology's understanding of personality disorders and trauma. These perspectives will ground our understanding in empirical research and observable patterns of behavior. In parallel, we will engage with diverse spiritual traditions, the Christian contemplative tradition's understanding of temptation, original sin, and the struggle for virtue, Buddhist teachings on Mara, the defilements, kleshas, ego attachment, and the roots of suffering, dukkha, Sufi and Islamic insights into the nafs, ego self, Iblis, and the veils of self-deception, Hindu and Vedantic philosophy on asuras, ahamkara, ego, and the illusion of separation, maya, and existential philosophies grappling with radical evil, the banality of evil, freedom, and personal responsibility. We will also touch upon indigenous wisdom, which often views evil as a form of imbalance or disconnection from the sacred web of life. By weaving together these seemingly disparate threads, we aim to uncover a more holistic and nuanced understanding of evil. We will demonstrate how psychological concepts like dehumanization find spiritual parallels in the loss of reverence for life, and how the Jungian shadow aligns with spiritual notions of unacknowledged sin or karmic patterns. The quote thus becomes a dynamic interpretive tool, not a literal entity to be feared, but a symbol of the profound internal and external forces that drive destructive acts and prevent our individual and collective flourishing. Understanding this archetype is not about demonizing others, but about illuminating the pathways to consciousness, compassion, and true integration. Over the course of this journey, we will embark on a multi-chapter exploration designed to illuminate the complex interplay between psychology and spirituality in the context of evil. Chapter 2: Defining Evil, Psychological and Spiritual Frameworks. We'll establish foundational definitions. We will examine the psychological criteria for evil actions, intent to harm, dehumanization, and profound cruelty, and contrast them with spiritual perspectives that often link evil to ignorance, separation from the divine, or the triumph of ego over higher consciousness. We will introduce key psychological theories such as Zimbardo's Lucifer effect and Jung's shadow, alongside spiritual concepts like the just through in Abrahamic traditions and the role of Mara in Buddhism. Chapter 3: The Inner Devil, Shadow Work and Ego Dynamics. We'll delve into the individual psyche. Here we will explore the Jungian shadow as the repository of unacknowledged aspects of self, both destructive and creative. We will analyze the psychological mechanisms of denial, projection, and repression that allow the inner four to gain power. Spiritually, we will examine the concept of the ego, nafs, ahamkara, as a source of self-deception and attachment, and discuss practices from various traditions designed to confront, integrate, and purify these inner forces. Chapter 4: The Collective Devil, Social Psychology of Evil. We'll broaden our scope to societal and systemic evil. This chapter will explore the social psychological phenomena that enable widespread atrocities, obedience to authority, Milgram, groupthink, conformity, and the processes of quote 5 and dehumanization. Spiritually, we will discuss how collective ignorance, fear, and attachment to ideologies can create conditions ripe for spiritual blindness and the perpetuation of cycles of violence, drawing parallels with karmic patterns and the concept of collective sin. Chapter 5: Manifestations of Evil, Case Studies and Archetypal Patterns. We'll bring theory to life through brief illustrative examples. We will examine historical figures and events, e.g. the banality of evil in Eichmann, cult dynamics, through both psychological and spiritual lenses. We will also consider how the devil archetype manifests in contemporary issues, from online hate to systemic injustice, demonstrating its enduring relevance. These will be analytical case studies, not extended fictional narratives. Chapter 6: Confronting Evil, Psychological and Spiritual Practices. We'll shift to solutions and pathways to healing. We will explore evidence-based psychological interventions for individuals, e.g. trauma therapy, cognitive restructuring, and communities, e.g. restorative justice. Alongside these, we will present spiritual practices from multiple traditions, such as compassion meditation, metta, contemplative prayer, forgiveness practices, and ethical living, dharma, that cultivate inner resilience and promote peace. Chapter 7: The Path to Integration and Redemption. We'll synthesize our findings, exploring how individuals and societies can integrate the shadow, heal from trauma, and transcend the cycles of evil. We will discuss the concept of redemption not as absolution without accountability, but as a profound process of transformation, acknowledging both psychological recovery and spiritual awakening. We will consider the role of free will, personal responsibility, and the cultivation of virtues in this ongoing journey. Finally, our conclusion: synthesis and transcending the archetype. We'll integrate the psychological and spiritual insights gathered throughout the essay, offering a contemplative reflection on the enduring challenge of evil and the perennial human quest for wholeness, compassion, and ultimate meaning. By the end of this journey, we hope to have illuminated not only the darkness represented by the devil archetype, but also the profound light of human potential for good, for healing, and for spiritual liberation. As we embark on this crucial second chapter, our immediate task is to delineate a comprehensive understanding of evil, moving beyond simplistic moralistic condemnations to establish a robust framework grounded in both psychological and spiritual inquiry. The very term quote 6 often evokes visceral reactions, yet its precise definition remains elusive, frequently conflated with mere wrongdoing or suffering. To effectively utilize the devil archetype as a diagnostic and interpretive tool, we must first articulate what constitutes the phenomenon it symbolizes, examining its contours through a dual lens that integrates the insights of modern psychology with the accumulated wisdom of spiritual traditions. Psychologically, evil can be characterized by a cluster of behaviors and internal states that systematically inflict profound suffering, degradation, and harm upon others. Central to this understanding is the intentionality of harm. This is not merely an accidental consequence of action, but a deliberate choice to cause physical, emotional, or psychological pain. The perpetrator often derives a perverse satisfaction or sense of power from this infliction, or at minimum exhibits an chilling indifference to the suffering caused. This intentionality distinguishes evil from accidental misfortune, or even from actions driven by desperation or self-preservation that inadvertently cause harm. We observe this in acts of cruelty, torture, and systematic oppression, where the deliberate erosion of another's humanity is not merely a byproduct, but often a primary objective. Further, a defining psychological criterion of evil is a profound empathy deficit or callousness. Empathy, the capacity to understand and share the feelings of another, serves as a fundamental moral compass, deterring actions that would cause distress. In the context of evil, this compass is either severely impaired or entirely absent. Individuals embodying this deficit are often capable of intellectually recognizing another's pain, but remain emotionally untouched by it. This detachment facilitates the dehumanization process, allowing the perpetrator to view others as mere objects, obstacles, or instruments for their own gratification or ideology. Personality disorders such as psychopathy and narcissistic personality disorder represent extreme manifestations of this condition, where a lack of remorse, superficial charm, and a pervasive disregard for the rights and feelings of others coalesce into patterns of destructive behavior. The absence of genuine connection, the inability to resonate with the inner world of another, creates a void into which destructive impulses can flow unchecked. The process of objectification and dehumanization stands as a critical psychological precursor and facilitator of evil. When individuals or groups are stripped of their unique humanity, reduced to stereotypes, labels, or abstractions, the moral barriers against harming them dissolve. They become, quote, 7, quote, 8, or, quote, 9, quote, to be eradicated, rather than fellow sentient beings deserving of dignity and respect. This psychological mechanism allows for atrocities on both individual and collective scales, as evidenced in genocides, systemic discrimination, and various forms of abuse. The devil archetype, in its externalized form, often functions precisely by encouraging this dehumanization, projecting the quote 10 as intrinsically malevolent, thus justifying any harm inflicted upon them. Moreover, the insidious mechanisms of moral disengagement provide a powerful psychological lens through which to understand how ordinary individuals can participate in or condone evil acts. Developed by Albert Bandura, this theory describes a series of cognitive maneuvers that allow individuals to reconcile their actions with their moral standards, effectively neutralizing self-condemnation. These include moral justification, reframing harmful acts as serving a higher moral purpose, euphemistic labeling, using sanitizing language to obscure the true nature of actions, e.g., quotas ostentatiosus for civilian deaths, advantageous comparison, contrasting one's own harmful acts with more egregious ones to make them seem less reprehensible, displacement of responsibility, attributing blame to authority figures, diffusion of responsibility, distributing blame across a group so no single individual feels accountable, distortion of consequences, minimizing or ignoring the harm caused, and attribution of blame, portraying victims as deserving of their suffering. These psychological processes demonstrate how the inner devil, rather than manifesting as overt malice, can operate through a sophisticated network of self-deception and rationalization, eroding conscience incrementally. Finally, psychologically, evil often manifests as myriad destructive patterns of behavior rather than isolated incidents. These patterns are characterized by their recurrence, their systemic nature, and their profound, often irreparable negative impact on individuals, relationships, and communities. These are not merely mistakes or lapses in judgment, but ingrained tendencies towards manipulation, control, exploitation, and the deliberate undermining of well-being. At the heart of many such patterns lies an inflated and fragile ego, driven by an insatiable desire for power, recognition, and dominance, often at the expense of others. This egoic drive, when unchecked, can lead to a pervasive sense of entitlement and a willingness to transgress ethical boundaries to maintain its perceived supremacy. Transitioning to the spiritual dimension, our definition of evil expands to encompass a state of profound separation from wholeness or the divine. In numerous spiritual traditions, the fundamental nature of reality is understood as interconnectedness, unity, or a transcendent source of love and compassion. Evil, from this perspective, represents a radical departure from this inherent unity, a disconnection from one's true, authentic self, from fellow beings, and from the sacred ground of existence. This separation is not merely a psychological state but an ontological one, leading to an experiential fragmentation that manifests as alienation, despair, and ultimately destructive actions. The devil archetype, in its spiritual symbolism, precisely embodies this principle of separation, portraying a force that seeks to divide, to alienate, and to sever the bonds of empathy and communion. A cornerstone of spiritual evil is ignorance, avidya in Hinduism and Buddhism, ghafla in Sufism. This is not a lack of intellectual knowledge, but a profound unawareness of one's true nature, of the interconnectedness of all life, and of the ultimate consequences of one's actions. This spiritual blindness leads to the misidentification with the transient ego, with material possessions, and with fleeting desires, fostering a distorted perception of reality. From this distorted view, actions arise that are rooted in craving, aversion, and delusion, perpetuating cycles of suffering for oneself and others. The devil archetype, often depicted as a deceiver or tempter, symbolizes the forces that actively cultivate and exploit this ignorance, leading humanity astray from the path of wisdom and liberation. Closely related to ignorance is attachment to illusion, Maya in Hinduism, samsara in Buddhism. Spiritual traditions consistently warn against the perils of clinging to the ephemeral world of forms, to egoic identities, and to the endless cycle of desires. When individuals become deeply enmeshed in these illusions, mistaking the temporary for the eternal and the self-centered for the sacred, they become susceptible to the allure of power, greed, and hatred. This attachment creates a spiritual blindness, preventing the recognition of genuine spiritual liberation and perpetuating a state of spiritual bondage. The temptations offered by figures like Mara, Buddhism, or Satan, Christianity, Islam, represent precisely these seductive illusions, the promise of worldly power, sensory gratification, or egoic validation, which when succumbed to lead to spiritual downfall and destructive behavior. Furthermore, spiritual evil can be understood as willful blindness or the rejection of truth. This is not merely an unconscious ignorance, but a deliberate turning away from spiritual insight, ethical imperatives, or the promptings of conscience, even when these are clearly presented. It is an active refusal to see, to learn, or to grow, often driven by fear, pride, or a vested interest in maintaining a particular worldview or power structure. This rejection represents an active choice against consciousness and compassion, a closing off of the heart and mind to transformative possibilities. The concept of the corruption of the heart or spirit also serves as a potent spiritual criterion for defining evil. Many traditions speak of the heart as the seat of compassion, wisdom, and spiritual perception. When this inner core is obscured, hardened, or perverted by negative emotions such as hatred, envy, or malice, the capacity for genuine love and connection diminishes. Actions stemming from such a corrupted heart lack integrity, compassion, and often lead to profound suffering. This spiritual degradation is a deep internal wound, manifesting externally as destructive behavior. Finally, in many spiritual frameworks, evil involves the violation of dharma or natural law. This refers to the transgression of universal ethical principles, cosmic order, or the inherent laws that govern harmonious existence. When individuals or societies act in ways that contravene these fundamental principles, such as justice, compassion, truth, and reciprocity, they create imbalance and disharmony, leading to suffering and spiritual decay. The devil archetype in various guises often personifies this transgression, representing the force that tempts one to deviate from the righteous path, to break sacred covenants, and to disrupt the natural flow of life. The seduction of power, viewed spiritually, becomes a profound failing when it leads to domination and exploitation rather than stewardship and service, signifying a deep misalignment with universal principles. Crucially, these psychological and spiritual criteria are not disparate but deeply intertwined. Psychological mechanisms of moral disengagement, for instance, often reflect and reinforce spiritual ignorance and attachment to egoic illusions. Conversely, a state of spiritual separation or ignorance can profoundly shape an individual's psychological landscape, fostering empathy deficits and destructive behavioral patterns. Our integrated definition acknowledges that evil operates on a spectrum, from subtle egoic self-interest that subtly undermines well-being, to overt acts of atrocity that shatter human dignity. It is a dynamic and pervasive phenomenon that requires a nuanced, multifaceted approach to comprehend. By establishing these psychological and spiritual criteria, we lay the groundwork for a more profound investigation into the nature of evil. This foundational definition will inform our subsequent exploration of the inner and collective manifestations of the devil archetype, moving us closer to understanding its pervasive influence within the human psyche and societal structures. Our aim remains not to demonize but to illuminate, to identify the mechanisms of darkness so that we may ultimately uncover pathways to consciousness, compassion, and spiritual liberation. The task is formidable, yet essential, for only by clearly defining that which we seek to understand can we hope to transcend its grasp. Having established a comprehensive dual-lens definition of evil, weaving together its psychological and spiritual dimensions, we now turn our focus to the dynamic interpretive tool at the heart of our inquiry, the devil archetype itself. Our exploration in this chapter will delve into the myriad ways this archetype manifests, both within the intricate landscape of the individual psyche and across the broader canvas of collective human experience. We contend that by understanding these manifestations, their forms, their deceptive allure, and their profound impact, we can begin to trace the pathways toward confrontation, integration, and ultimately transcendence. The devil archetype, in its various guises, does not merely represent evil. It embodies the very processes through which evil takes root, flourishes, and exerts its destructive influence. Within the individual, the most potent and insidious manifestation of the devil archetype often resides in what Jungian psychology terms the shadow. This inner devil is not an external entity, but a psychological repository of all that the ego deems unacceptable, undesirable, or threatening. It comprises repressed desires, unacknowledged weaknesses, unlived potentials, and the darker impulses we strive to disown. The shadow, therefore, becomes a psychological projection screen onto which we cast our own discomforting truths. When left unexamined and unintegrated, the shadow looms large, a subterranean current capable of erupting into destructive behaviours. We observe how its repression leads to projection, the attributing of our own disavowed traits onto others, thereby creating enemies and justifying contempt, a foundational step in the process of dehumanization that underpins much of human cruelty. The deliberate, intentional harm we identified as a core psychological criterion of evil frequently emerges from an unintegrated shadow, where unconscious rage, envy, or fear finds an outlet, often disguised or rationalized. Complementing and often reinforcing the unintegrated shadow is the unexamined ego, a spiritual and psychological construct that, in its inflated or unawakened state, represents the self-centered aspect of human consciousness. In traditions such as Sufism, this is known as nafs, and in Hindu philosophy, ahamkara. This ego, when unchecked, becomes a primary source of self-deception, attachment to illusion, and spiritual blindness. It generates the illusion of separation from others, from the divine, from the interconnected web of existence, fostering a narcissistic worldview where personal gratification, power, and control become paramount. The ego's insatiable hunger for validation and its inherent fragility often compel it to engage in the very mechanisms of moral disengagement we previously outlined. It justifies its actions, renames destructive acts with euphemistic labels, displaces responsibility, and blames victims, all to protect its perceived integrity and maintain its self-serving narrative. This self-centeredness directly contributes to the empathy deficit, as the ego, absorbed in its own desires and fears, struggles to genuinely recognize or value the suffering of others. We see how the ego's attachment to its own constructs of reality, its rigid beliefs, and its fear of vulnerability makes it susceptible to the allure of the devil archetype's promises of power and control, leading to a profound corruption of the heart and a willful blindness to truth. The interplay between the unintegrated shadow and the unexamined ego creates a fertile ground for the devil archetype to manifest internally, distorting perception, fueling destructive impulses, and severing the individual from their innate capacity for compassion and wholeness. It is within this internal crucible that the seeds of evil are sown, cultivated by ignorance and attachment, and allowed to blossom into patterns of destructive behavior. Beyond the individual, the devil archetype extends its influence into the collective sphere, manifesting through societal structures, cultural narratives, and historical patterns of oppression. Here, we observe the collective shadow and the collective ego at play. Just as individuals repress their undesirable traits, societies often disown their darker histories, their systemic injustices, and their capacities for cruelty, projecting these onto designated quote 14. This process of quote 15 is a direct manifestation of the devil archetype at a collective level, where entire groups are dehumanized, labeled as enemies, and viewed as repositories of all that is feared and despised. This collective projection becomes the psychological underpinning for genocide, war, and systemic discrimination. The devil archetype in this context does not merely represent an external threat. It is the symbolic embodiment of the collective's unacknowledged darkness, its capacity for cruelty, and its willingness to sacrifice certain groups for the perceived benefit or purity of the dominant collective ego. We witness this in the construction of ideological frameworks that justify violence, exploitation, and authoritarian control. The devil archetype provides the narrative template for propaganda, allowing leaders to demonize opponents, rally support for aggressive actions, and suppress dissent. It underpins the mechanisms of moral disengagement on a grand scale, enabling entire populations to passively accept or actively participate in atrocities by displacing responsibility onto abstract systems, attributing blame to victims, or morally justifying their actions as necessary for a greater good. The allure of power, control, and tribal belonging, often promised by the devil archetype, seduces collective egos into cycles of aggression and self-destruction, perpetuating profound violations of dharma and natural law. When societies succumb to the ego's illusion of separation and the shadow's unacknowledged rage, the result is often systemic evil, the institutionalization of harm, suffering, and injustice. Across diverse spiritual traditions, the devil archetype appears in myriad forms, each offering a unique lens through which to understand the forces of temptation, defilement, and spiritual obstruction. These cultural manifestations are not to be understood as literal beings, but as powerful symbolic representations of the internal and external, psychological and spiritual challenges that humanity faces. In Buddhism, Mara embodies the forces of temptation, attachment, and illusion that seek to prevent spiritual awakening. Mara represents not just external seductions, but the deep-seated defilements of the mind, craving, aversion, and delusion. He is the internal whisperer who encourages us to cling to transient pleasures, to identify with our suffering, and to believe in the solidity of a separate self. Mara's primary strategy is to obscure the truth of impermanence and interconnectedness, thereby maintaining the cycle of suffering. His manifestations are the psychological traps of ego attachment, the spiritual blindness born of ignorance, and the corruption of the heart through grasping. Within the Abrahamic traditions, figures like Satan or Iblis serve as profound manifestations of the devil archetype, particularly emphasizing themes of rebellion, arrogance, and deception. Iblis, in Islamic tradition, refused to bow to Adam out of pride, believing himself superior, thereby embodying the ultimate act of egoic self-aggrandizement and separation from divine will. Satan, in Christian theology, is the adversary, the tempter, and the deceiver, sowing doubt and leading humanity away from the path of righteousness. These figures symbolize the internal inclination towards disobedience, the seduction of worldly power, the envy that poisons the heart, and the subtle whispers of doubt that challenge faith and truth. They represent the willful blindness and rejection of divine guidance, leading to a profound separation from wholeness and the violation of spiritual law. Hindu and Buddhist cosmologies also feature the asuras, powerful beings often depicted as anti-gods or demons who embody pride, anger, delusion, and insatiable desire. They represent the forces that challenge the established cosmic order, dharma, and seek to dominate through brute force and egoic assertion. The asuras manifest the destructive patterns of behavior driven by an inflated and often fragile ego, reflecting humanity's own struggle with these internal vices and their external consequences in the world. Their narratives serve as cautionary tales, illustrating the futility of seeking lasting happiness through material gain, power, or self-aggrandizement. Even the ambivalent figure of the trickster, found in various indigenous mythologies, can be seen as a nuanced manifestation of the devil archetype. While often serving a chaotic, disruptive, and even creative function, the trickster also embodies the disruptive, unpredictable, and sometimes destructive forces that challenge norms and expose hypocrisy. Tricksters, through their cunning and often immoral actions, can inadvertently reveal hidden truths or catalyze change, but they also represent the potential for chaos, deception, and the breakdown of order, reflecting humanity's own capacity for both constructive and destructive mischief. Their ambiguity highlights the complex nature of the shadow, which contains both creative and destructive potentials. In examining these diverse cultural manifestations, we recognize a common thread. Each figure, in its unique cultural context, symbolizes the psychological and spiritual forces that draw us away from our highest potential, encourage self-deception, foster attachment to illusion, and lead to intentional harm. Whether it is Mara's temptations, Iblis's arrogance, the Asura's wrath, or the trickster's disruption, these archetypal forms provide profound insights into the internal and external battles we must wage to achieve consciousness and spiritual liberation. Understanding these manifestations is not an end in itself, but a crucial preliminary step. It is through this clear-eyed recognition of the devil archetype's presence, in our own hearts, in our societies, and in the wisdom of our traditions, that we can begin to formulate strategies for its confrontation, integration, and ultimately its transcendence, transforming its destructive potential into a catalyst for profound growth and wholeness. Having explored the diverse manifestations of the devil archetype across individual psyches, collective societies, and various spiritual traditions, we now turn our attention to the insidious mechanisms through which this archetypal force exerts its influence. Understanding how the devil archetype operates, its strategies of deception, its seduction of power, and its corrosive effect on empathy and conscience, is paramount for recognizing its presence and developing pathways towards psychological integration and spiritual liberation. In this chapter, we will delineate these operational mechanisms, illustrating their profound impact on human behavior and the trajectory of consciousness. One of the primary and most pervasive mechanisms of the devil archetype is the propagation of deception and illusion. This operates on multiple levels, both within the individual psyche and across collective consciousness. Internally, the archetype often works through the unexamined key, ego, the nafs in Sufism, ahamkara in Hinduism, which constructs elaborate narratives of self-justification, denial, and exceptionalism. This internal deception allows individuals to rationalize actions that cause harm, framing them as necessary, deserved, or even righteous. The unintegrated Jungian shadow contributes significantly here, projecting our unacknowledged flaws and destructive impulses onto others, thereby creating a distorted reality where we are perpetually the victim or the morally superior agent. This self-deception is a form of willful blindness, a deliberate turning away from uncomfortable truths about our own complicity or capacity for cruelty. It is the subtle whisper that tells us our desires are paramount, our actions are beyond reproach, and our perceived enemies are inherently less worthy. Spiritually, this mechanism aligns with the Buddhist concept of Mara, the tempter who creates illusions, Maya, to bind sentient beings to the cycle of suffering through attachment and delusion. Mara's deceptions are not merely external temptations, but represent the internal mental defilements that cloud our perception of reality, convincing us that transient pleasures are ultimate goods, or that separation is an immutable truth. Similarly, the Abrahamic Satan Iblis is depicted as the master deceiver, whose primary weapon is cunning and misguidance, leading humanity astray through false promises, enticing worldly desires, and fostering arrogance. The trickster archetype, too, while sometimes having a dual nature, often employs deception and chaos to disrupt established orders, which, in its darker aspect, can lead to widespread confusion and moral relativism, eroding the foundations of truth and trust. The ultimate illusion fostered by the devil archetype is the belief in fundamental separation from others, from nature, and from the sacred interconnectedness of all life. This illusion fuels self-centeredness and provides the psychological groundwork for objectification and dehumanization. A second potent mechanism is the seduction of power and control. The devil archetype exploits humanity's innate drive for security, mastery, and influence, twisting it into an insatiable craving for dominance over others. This mechanism manifests when the legitimate pursuit of competence or positive influence morphs into a tyrannical will to subjugate, exploit, and oppress. The inflated ego, unchecked and unexamined, becomes a conduit for this destructive ambition, perceiving others not as fellow beings, but as instruments or obstacles to its own aggrandizement. This quest for power is often rooted in deep-seated fear and insecurity, paradoxically seeking to control external circumstances as a way to alleviate internal anxieties. On a collective level, this mechanism is evident in authoritarian regimes, systems of oppression, and corporate structures that prioritize profit or control over human well-being and ecological balance. The Asuras in Hindu and Buddhist traditions perfectly embody this mechanism, characterized by their immense power, pride, and insatiable desire for dominance, often leading to conflict and suffering. They represent the archetypal force that seeks to usurp divine order through force and ambition. When individuals or groups succumb to this seduction, they begin to see the world as a zero-sum game, where one's gain necessitates another's loss, and where empathy is deemed a weakness rather than a strength. The allure of absolute control can lead to extreme measures, including violence and the systematic dehumanization of those who stand in the way. Power, when wielded under the influence of the devil archetype, becomes a tool for tyranny, silencing dissent and enforcing conformity, thereby stifling individual agency and collective flourishing. The third and perhaps most devastating mechanism of the devil archetype is the erosion of empathy and conscience. This process is crucial for enabling the intentional harm that defines evil. The archetype actively works to diminish our capacity for compassion, moral discernment, and the recognition of the shared humanity of others. The initial step in this erosion is often objectification and dehumanization, where the other is stripped of their individuality, their feelings, and their inherent worth, reducing them to a category, a problem, or an enemy. This process is actively facilitated by the devil archetype's illusions of separation and its narratives of superiority or victimhood, which justify seeing certain groups as less than human. Once dehumanized, the suffering of the quote 17 becomes less real, less significant, and less capable of eliciting a compassionate response. This erosion is further cemented through the psychological processes of moral disengagement, which we briefly touched upon in Chapter 2. These mechanisms, such as moral justification, reframing harmful acts as noble, advantageous comparison, comparing one's actions to worse ones, euphemistic labeling, using sanitized language to obscure harm, displacement of responsibility, attributing blame to authority, diffusion of responsibility, sharing blame across a group, distortion of consequences, minimizing the harm caused, and attribution of blame, blaming the victim, are not merely cognitive errors. They are the practical outworkings of the devil archetype's influence, systematically dismantling the individual's moral compass. They serve as psychological defenses that allow individuals to perpetrate or condone evil without experiencing overwhelming guilt or cognitive dissonance. Spiritually, this manifests as a subtle hardening of the heart, a closing off from the innate capacity for love, truth, and interconnectedness. It is the corruption of the heart that Chapter 2 identified as a core spiritual dimension of evil, where the internal voice of conscience is silenced, replaced by the dictates of the ego or external ideological pressures. This spiritual callousness makes genuine remorse difficult and perpetuates cycles of harm. These mechanisms of deception, the seduction of power, and the erosion of empathy and conscience do not operate in isolation. They are deeply intertwined, creating a reinforcing feedback loop. Internal vulnerabilities, such as an unintegrated shadow or an inflated ego, make individuals more susceptible to external temptations and collective illusions. Societal narratives, power structures, and cultural ideologies, in turn, can amplify these internal predispositions, providing fertile ground for the devil archetype to flourish. Environments characterized by fear, ignorance, unchecked ambition, and a lack of critical self-reflection become breeding grounds for its influence, perpetuating cycles of suffering and spiritual blindness. The archetype thrives where consciousness is dim, where reflection is avoided, and where the human heart remains unexamined. Ultimately, understanding these operational mechanisms of the devil archetype is not merely an academic exercise. It is a vital step toward recognizing its pervasive influence in our lives and in the world. By dissecting how it deceives, how it seduces, and how it corrodes our moral faculties, we begin to illuminate the pathways for resistance, for integration, and for ultimately reclaiming our capacity for consciousness, compassion, and wholeness. This analytical clarity provides the necessary groundwork for the next stage of our inquiry, exploring the strategies for confronting and transforming the devil archetype, both within ourselves and in the collective human experience. The insidious efficacy of the devil archetype's mechanisms, deception, the seduction of power, and the erosion of empathy, culminates not merely in abstract theoretical constructs, but in the tangible and often devastating reality of suffering. Having meticulously delineated the operational strategies through which this archetype manifests and perpetuates itself, we must now turn our focus to the profound consequences of its unchecked influence. This chapter will explore how these interwoven mechanisms translate into the deep psychological and spiritual distress experienced by individuals, and the widespread societal fragmentation, conflict, and injustice that characterize the collective human experience. We posit that the pervasive suffering witnessed across millennia is not merely an unfortunate byproduct, but a direct and inevitable outcome of humanity's entanglement with the devil archetype's machinations, particularly its fundamental reinforcement of the illusion of separation. The labyrinth of individual suffering, often a solitary and harrowing journey, serves as a primary testament to the devil archetype's potency. When the ego, fueled by deception, and the allure of self-aggrandizement, remains unexamined, it inevitably leads to a profound internal fragmentation. The individual becomes estranged from their authentic self, caught in a relentless cycle of self-deception and external validation. This psychological disquiet manifests as chronic anxiety, existential despair, and a pervasive sense of meaninglessness, even amidst material abundance. The unacknowledged shadow, laden with repressed aspects of the self, exerts a subtle yet persistent influence, often leading to self-sabotage, projection onto others, and an inability to forge genuine empathic connections. Spiritually, the illusion of separation from the divine or from the interconnected web of existence creates a profound void within the human heart. This spiritual emptiness, often masked by compulsive behaviors, addictions, or a relentless pursuit of fleeting pleasures, is the quote 18 that the archetype so skillfully cultivates. It is a state of being where the individual, severed from their source of wholeness and compassion, experiences a profound sense of alienation, not only from others, but, more tragically, from themselves. The ethical compass, dulled by the erosion of conscience, leaves the individual adrift in a sea of moral ambiguity, susceptible to despair, and increasingly prone to actions that further deepen their own suffering and that of those around them. This internal landscape, scarred by the archetype's influence, becomes a breeding ground for self-destruction, perpetuating cycles of harm that are difficult to break without a profound reorientation of consciousness. Beyond the individual psyche, the devil archetype casts a long, dark shadow over the collective human experience, manifesting as the pervasive scars of societal suffering. The erosion of empathy, when amplified across a populace, transforms into systemic injustice, oppression, and dehumanization on a grand scale. The seduction of power, when embraced by individuals or groups, inevitably leads to the establishment of authoritarian structures that privilege control over compassion and dominance over dialogue. We observe how the archetype orchestrates the creation of us versus them narratives, where entire groups are demonized and objectified, making possible atrocities ranging from historical genocides to contemporary forms of systemic discrimination. Wars, conflicts, and the relentless pursuit of ideological purity at the expense of human lives are all stark manifestations of a collective consciousness gripped by the devil archetype. Here, the collective shadow projects its unacknowledged fears and aggressions onto the other, justifying violence and perpetuating cycles of retribution. Furthermore, the archetype's influence extends to our relationship with the natural world. The exploitation of resources, the disregard for ecological balance, and the relentless drive for material acquisition at any cost are symptomatic of a fragmented consciousness that perceives nature as a separate entity to be conquered and consumed, rather than an integral part of an interconnected whole. This environmental degradation, with its cascading consequences for all life, is a profound testament to the collective ego's unchecked ambition and its spiritual disconnect from the reverence for life. Perhaps one of the most insidious aspects of the devil archetype's influence is its capacity for intergenerational transmission. The unaddressed individual and collective shadows do not simply dissipate with time. Rather, they are often unconsciously passed down through generations, creating enduring cycles of trauma, violence, and injustice. We observe how the psychological patterns of fear, distrust, and aggression, born from past wounds and the archetype's reinforcement of separation, become embedded in family systems and cultural narratives. This phenomenon, often termed inherited trauma, demonstrates how the unresolved suffering of one generation can manifest as emotional dysregulation, maladaptive coping mechanisms, and even physical ailments in subsequent generations. Societies that fail to acknowledge and integrate their collective shadows, their histories of oppression, war, and moral failings, are prone to repeating these patterns. The archetype thrives in environments where historical wounds remain unhealed, where truth is suppressed, and where the mechanisms of moral disengagement are culturally normalized. Cultural myths, educational systems, and societal conditioning can either perpetuate these destructive patterns by reinforcing narratives of blame and victimhood, or they can offer pathways for healing and transformation by promoting empathy, reconciliation, and a deeper understanding of shared humanity. The devil archetype, in essence, leverages the unexamined past to shape a future defined by continued fragmentation and suffering, unless a conscious effort is made to break these inherited chains. At the deepest ontological level, all these forms of suffering, individual fragmentation, collective injustice, and intergenerational trauma, ultimately stem from the fundamental illusion of separation. This illusion, the very bedrock upon which the devil archetype builds its dominion, posits that we are isolated entities, disconnected from ourselves, from each other, and from the sacred essence of existence. It is this manufactured sense of separateness that fuels egocentricity, giving rise to the pervasive fear of the other, the relentless drive for individual gain at the expense of the collective, and the profound spiritual blindness that characterizes much of human history. When we perceive ourselves as fundamentally distinct and independent, the ethical imperative to care for others diminishes, and the spiritual recognition of our shared interconnectedness fades. The devil archetype, whether manifesting as Mara's illusions, Satan's deception, or the ego's self-justifications, consistently reinforces this false narrative, convincing us that competition is paramount, that resources are scarce, and that our individual survival depends on the subjugation or elimination of perceived threats. This fundamental misperception of reality is the ultimate ignorance, avidya, ghafla, that the spiritual traditions speak of, leading directly to attachment to illusion, maya, samsara, and a willful blindness to the unifying truth of existence. The suffering we witness, therefore, is not an arbitrary cosmic punishment, but the logical and unavoidable consequence of living within the confines of this grand illusion. The profound recognition of this pervasive suffering, both personal and universal, serves as the crucible for transformation. It is the necessary catalyst that impels us to seek deeper understanding, to confront the mechanisms of the devil archetype within ourselves and our societies, and ultimately to embark upon the arduous yet liberating journey of integration. Only by acknowledging the depth and breadth of this suffering can we truly appreciate the urgency of the task before us, to dismantle the illusion of separation, to cultivate genuine empathy, and to reclaim our inherent capacity for wholeness and compassion. This understanding of suffering, therefore, is not an endpoint but a vital turning point, preparing us for the proactive engagement with the archetype that will be the focus of our subsequent inquiry. We are called to move beyond mere observation to active participation in the work of healing and reintegration, to transcend the archetypal grip and step into a more conscious and compassionate way of being. The profound suffering elucidated in our previous chapter, manifesting as individual fragmentation, societal injustice, and intergenerational trauma, serves not as an endpoint but as a stark and undeniable catalyst. It is in the crucible of this suffering that we are presented with an urgent imperative, to move beyond mere recognition and towards active engagement with the forces symbolized by the devil archetype. This engagement is not a battle in the conventional sense, but a turning inward, a courageous and radical act of honesty designed to confront, understand, and ultimately integrate the fragmented and destructive aspects of the human psyche and spirit. In this chapter, we will delineate the critical pathways to confronting this inner devil, focusing on the cultivation of radical awareness, the acknowledgement and reclamation of the shadow, and the disarming of the ego. Our journey into confrontation begins with the cultivation of radical awareness, a deliberate and sustained effort to illuminate the often hidden mechanisms through which the devil archetype operates within us. Psychologically, this involves a deep dive into self-reflection and mindfulness. We turn inward, not to judge, but to observe with dispassionate curiosity the egoic patterns, the subtle whispers of attachment, the projections of our unacknowledged selves onto others, and the myriad biases that colour our perceptions. Mindfulness becomes our primary lens, allowing us to witness the genesis of thoughts, emotions, and impulses, particularly those that foster separation, anger, fear, or the desire for dominance. Through this sustained internal observation, we begin to identify the precise moments and conditions under which the quote 22, the allure of short-term gain for long-term spiritual cost, is presented to our consciousness. Tools such as journaling, introspective meditation, and therapeutic inquiry serve as invaluable aids in externalizing these internal dynamics, bringing them from the murky depths of the unconscious into the light of conscious examination. We learn to discern the subtle shifts in our inner landscape that precede acts of moral disengagement or the hardening of the heart, recognizing these internal movements as the direct influence of the archetype. Spiritually, radical awareness manifests as discernment, viveka, the profound capacity to distinguish between truth and illusion, maya, between the authentic self and the constructed ego, nafs, ahamkara. This is an awakening to the subtle deceptions propagated by the archetype, allowing us to see through the veil of ignorance, avidya, that fosters our attachment to impermanent forms and self-serving narratives. We cultivate a witness consciousness, an ability to observe the incessant play of the mind and emotions from a detached, higher perspective, recognizing that we are not merely the sum of our fleeting thoughts or reactive impulses. This spiritual discernment enables us to identify the quote 23 greed, hatred and delusion quote that Mara, the Buddhist tempter, marshals as his army. We begin to recognize the insidious pride and self-aggrandizement characteristic of the asuras, and the self-deception and rebellious whispers that echo the narratives of Satan and Iblis, not as external entities, but as internal tendencies vying for control of our awareness and actions. This conscious recognition is the first step towards disarming their power, for what is seen clearly can no longer operate from the shadows of unconscious influence. Following the cultivation of radical awareness, the next crucial step in confronting the inner devil is the acknowledgement and reclamation of the shadow. As Jungian psychology profoundly illustrates, the shadow is indeed our quote 24, the psychological repository of all that we have deemed unacceptable, undesirable, or quote 25 within ourselves and subsequently repressed. These unacknowledged aspects, rather than disappearing, fester in the unconscious, gaining power and often manifesting through unconscious projections onto others. This mechanism is central to the process of quote 26 and dehumanization, where the very traits we deny in ourselves, our own capacity for cruelty, selfishness or aggression, are cast onto an external group, thereby justifying our hostility or indifference towards them. The process of reclaiming the shadow is not about condoning destructive behaviors, but about understanding the underlying needs, wounds or energies that give rise to them. It necessitates a courageous confrontation with our own hypocrisy, our own hidden biases, and our own potential for harm. We begin by identifying our projections. Where do we consistently see double quote 27 or double quote 28 in others? What aspects of humanity do we vehemently condemn? Often, these external judgments are mirrors reflecting the unacknowledged contents of our own shadow. Reclaiming involves a radical acceptance that these quote 29 quote aspects are indeed part of our human inheritance. For instance, anger, often repressed, can be a vital signal that a boundary has been violated, or a motivator for justice. The desire for power, when integrated, can manifest as leadership, agency, or the capacity to effect positive change, rather than domination. By bringing these repressed energies into conscious awareness, we can integrate them constructively, transforming potential destructive forces into sources of creativity, resilience, and authentic self-expression. This integration diminishes the need for projection, thereby reducing the fuel for external conflict and fostering a more compassionate and realistic view of ourselves and others. The shadow, once feared as a source of evil, is revealed to contain both destructive and immensely creative potential, awaiting conscious engagement. Finally, the confrontation with the inner devil culminates in the vital process of disarming the ego, or transcending the limitations of nafs, the self-serving soul in Islamic tradition, and ahamkara, the ego sense in Hinduism. The ego, in its unexamined state, is a primary propagator of the illusion of separation, fostering self-centeredness, attachment, and an insatiable need for control and validation. It is the source of self-importance, defensiveness, and the victim mentality, all of which obstruct genuine connection and spiritual growth. Psychologically, disarming the ego involves cultivating humility, recognizing our inherent interconnectedness with all beings and the vastness of existence beyond our individual perceptions. It requires the active expansion of empathy, a deliberate effort to step into the perspectives of others, even those we find challenging, thereby dissolving the rigid boundaries of self-interest. We practice non-attachment, not to life itself, but to the transient outcomes, opinions, possessions, and even the fixed identities we construct for ourselves. This psychological work loosens the ego's grip, allowing for greater flexibility, resilience, and an openness to experience. Spiritually, disarming the ego often involves self-surrender, a conscious release of the need for individual control and a deep alignment with a higher will, a universal dharma, or the flow of existence. This is not passive resignation, but an active choice to relinquish the ego's incessant demands for mastery over life, trusting instead in a greater wisdom. Ego transcendence moves us beyond the limited self-referential perception of self to embrace a broader interconnected consciousness, where the boundaries between quote 30 and quote 31 begin to dissolve. Practices of service, karma yoga, are profoundly effective in this regard, shifting our focus from personal gain to the welfare of others, thereby naturally diminishing the ego's self-centered tendencies. By consistently challenging the ego's narratives and attachments, we weaken its hold, allowing for the emergence of a more authentic, compassionate, and expansive sense of self. This journey of confrontation and integration, through radical awareness, shadow reclamation, and ego disarming, is inherently challenging, often bringing us face to face with uncomfortable truths. It is precisely for this reason that compassion and self-compassion become indispensable guides. Without self-compassion, the process of confronting our inner darkness can easily devolve into self-judgment, becoming another form of egoic suffering. Instead, we approach our own imperfections with the same understanding and kindness we would offer a struggling friend, recognizing that our destructive patterns often emerge from pain, fear, or ignorance. Similarly, compassion for others, even those who embody what we perceive as quote 32 quote stems from a deeper understanding that their actions too may arise from unacknowledged pain, profound ignorance, or an unintegrated shadow. This does not excuse harmful behavior, but allows us to respond from a place of wisdom and a desire for healing, rather than reactive judgment. Through this sustained, courageous engagement, the devil archetype begins to shift its role. No longer merely a destructive force or a harbinger of suffering, it transforms into a potent catalyst for growth and profound spiritual awakening. It becomes a relentless quote, 33 continually revealing the areas within us that still require attention, integration, and conscious illumination. This ongoing process leads not to the eradication of our human complexities, but to greater wholeness, authenticity, and a significant reduction in both the internal and external manifestations of what we define as quote 34. We learn to navigate the complexities of our inner and outer worlds with quote 34 greater wisdom, fostering a deeper connection to ourselves, to others, and to the interconnected web of all existence, moving steadily towards a state of conscious liberation. Having established the critical processes of radical awareness, shadow reclamation, and ego disarming as foundational to confronting the devil archetype, we now turn our focus to the active path of integration and redemption. This phase moves beyond identification and initial engagement, delving into the sustained practices and profound inner shifts required to cultivate genuine wholeness and compassion. It is in this crucible of conscious effort that the archetype, once a formidable internal and external adversary, begins its transformation into a catalyst for profound personal and collective evolution. Our journey here is one of alchemical transmutation, where the lead of unacknowledged darkness is refined into the gold of spiritual liberation. The process of deepening shadow reclamation is not a singular event, but an ongoing, alchemical endeavor. It demands sustained courage to plumb the depths of our unacknowledged self, confronting aspects often laden with shame, fear, and societal condemnation. We move beyond merely acknowledging the shadow's existence to actively engaging with its contents, understanding its origins and integrating its latent energy. Practical methodologies for this include dedicated self-reflection, often facilitated through journaling, where we meticulously record dreams, recurring emotional patterns, and automatic reactions that signal the shadow's influence. Active imagination, a Jungian technique, allows us to engage in dialogue with these personified inner figures, understanding their motivations and their unfulfilled needs. Similarly, dream analysis provides a potent symbolic language through which the unconscious communicates its hidden wisdom and unintegrated parts. The goal is never to eradicate the shadow, which is an impossible and undesirable task, but rather to assimilate its energy, transforming destructive potentials, such as aggression or envy, into constructive forces like assertiveness, passion, or a drive for justice. This reclamation is fundamentally about quote 35, quote, thereby expanding the domain of our awareness and reducing the likelihood of projecting our inner demons onto others. It is a profound act of self-ownership, essential for dismantling the externalized manifestations of the devil archetype. Concurrently, refining ego disarming requires an equally rigorous and sustained commitment. While initial steps involve cultivating humility and practicing non-attachment, the deeper work entails a continuous vigilance against the myriad subtle manifestations of the ego, the nafs, the ahamkara. We learn to discern the ego's insidious whispers in our thoughts, its attachment to outcomes, its need for validation, its subtle judgments, and its pervasive illusion of separation. This disarming is not an annihilation of the ego, which serves a vital function in navigating the material world, but rather its reorientation. The ego, once the self-proclaimed master, must learn to become the humble servant of the higher self, of our authentic nature, or of the divine will. Practices such as daily mindfulness meditation allow us to observe egoic thoughts and emotions without identification, creating a space for detachment. Self-inquiry, a cornerstone of Advaita Vedanta and other wisdom traditions, challenges the very notion of a separate, enduring quote 36 quote by asking quote 37 quote until the illusion of the ego's solidity begins to dissolve. Furthermore, selfless service, karma yoga, zakat, dana, provides a powerful antidote to egoic self-centeredness, directing our energies outward in altruistic action, thereby diminishing the ego's grip and fostering a profound sense of interconnectedness. This continuous process liberates us from the spiritual blindness and self-deception that are hallmarks of the devil archetype's influence, allowing our actions to flow from a place of genuine compassion and wisdom rather than self-interest or the desire for control. Central to this entire path of integration and redemption is the transformative power of compassion and forgiveness. Compassion, as we have previously noted, serves as our unwavering guide. It begins with self-compassion, which is absolutely vital when confronting the often painful truths revealed during shadow reclamation and ego disarming. Without self-compassion, the process can devolve into self-condemnation, reinforcing the very shame and guilt that the shadow thrives upon. Self-compassion allows us to approach our perceived flaws and past transgressions with kindness and understanding, recognizing our shared humanity and the universal struggles inherent in the human condition. It creates a safe inner space for healing and integration, enabling us to transform self-criticism into self-acceptance and growth. Beyond the self, compassion for others is the bridge that dissolves the illusion of separation, a fundamental tenet of the devil archetype. By cultivating empathy, we begin to understand that destructive behaviors often stem from deep-seated suffering, ignorance, or unhealed trauma, even while we unequivocally condemn the actions themselves. This does not condone evil, but rather seeks to understand its roots, allowing us to respond with wisdom rather than reactive blame or retribution. This understanding is crucial for breaking cycles of projection and fostering reconciliation, both personally and collectively. Hand in hand with compassion is forgiveness. This is a profound spiritual practice encompassing both self-forgiveness and the forgiveness of others. Self-forgiveness is the release from the burden of past mistakes, the acknowledgement that we too have been susceptible to the devil archetype's influence, and a commitment to learn and grow from those experiences. It is a liberation from the internalized judge and the cycle of self-punishment. Forgiving others, however challenging, is not about absolving the perpetrator or forgetting the harm done. It is primarily about freeing ourselves from the chains of resentment, anger, and victimhood that bind us to the past. Resentment is often described as drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Forgiveness, then, is the antidote. It is an act of radical self-liberation, allowing us to reclaim our inner peace and move forward with an open heart. Both forms of forgiveness actively dismantle the devil archetype's stronghold, which thrives on division, grievance, and the perpetuation of cycles of harm. By dissolving these energetic ties, we actively participate in the healing of the collective human heart and move closer to a state of profound interconnectedness. The culmination of these practices leads to the sustained cultivation of wholeness, the synthesis of opposites. This is the emergence of the self in Jungian terms, the totality of the psyche, encompassing both conscious and unconscious, light and shadow. It is also the realization of the true self, or Atman in spiritual traditions, transcending the ego's limitations and experiencing our inherent unity with all existence. In this state, the devil archetype ceases to be an externalized monster or an overwhelming internal force. Instead, it transforms into a profound, quote, 40, its manifestations revealing precisely where integration is still needed, where our consciousness remains fragmented, and where the illusion of separation persists. The journey towards wholeness is not a static destination, but a dynamic, ongoing process of balancing and reintegrating the myriad aspects of our being. We learn to hold paradox, embracing both our divine potential and our human fallibility, our capacity for light and our potential for darkness. This embrace leads to an authentic sense of inner peace, a deep feeling of being complete and connected, which resonates outward to foster harmonious relationships with others and the natural world. It is the experience of unity, where the artificial boundaries erected by the ego and exploited by the archetype begin to dissolve, revealing the underlying fabric of interdependence that binds all life. Ultimately, this path empowers us to transcend the archetype, moving beyond dualism. This does not imply the eradication of the symbolic capacity for evil within the human psyche, for the archetypal patterns are inherent to the collective unconscious. Rather, it signifies a profound transformation in our relationship with the devil archetype. When its lessons are fully learned, when we have consciously faced our shadows, disarmed our egos, and cultivated profound compassion and forgiveness, its power over us diminishes significantly. It ceases to be a controlling, destructive force, and instead becomes a potent symbol of the ongoing journey of consciousness itself. We no longer project its influence onto external scapegoats, nor do we allow it to dominate our internal landscape. Instead, the archetype serves as a constant reminder of the vigilance required to maintain self-awareness, compassion, and ethical conduct. We shift from being unwitting victims or unconscious perpetrators of its influence to becoming conscious navigators of our inner and outer worlds. This transcendence marks a fundamental shift from a dualistic perception of good versus evil to a more integrated understanding of the interplay of forces within a unified field of consciousness. The energy once bound in destructive patterns is liberated and redirected towards creative, compassionate, and life-affirming endeavors. This profound inner freedom and peace, born from the arduous work of self-integration, naturally extends outward, contributing to the creation of a more just, equitable, and compassionate world. It is through this comprehensive path of integration and redemption that humanity begins to actualize its highest potential, moving towards spiritual liberation and manifesting a collective reality rooted in awareness, love, and unity. The devil archetype, in its final transformation, thus becomes a testament not to inherent evil, but to the extraordinary human capacity for growth, healing, and the ultimate triumph of consciousness. Having navigated the arduous terrain of confrontation, integration, and ultimate transcendence, we now arrive at a pivotal juncture, the lived reality of an individual and, by extension, a collective that has moved beyond the thrall of the devil archetype. This is not to suggest an eradication of potential darkness, for the polarities remain intrinsic to existence, but rather a profound reorientation of our relationship to these forces. The energy once bound in resistance, projection, and self-deception is liberated, transforming the very ground of our being and our engagement with the world. The first and most profound consequence of transcending the archetype is the emergence of the integrated self. This is the realization of the, quote, 41 or quote 42 a state where the disparate elements of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, ego and self, are no longer warring factions but harmoniously integrated components of a greater whole. The individual who has undertaken this journey no longer experiences the inner fragmentation, anxiety, and spiritual emptiness that plagued them when the archetype held sway. Instead, an abiding sense of inner peace, clarity, and authentic power takes root. The shadow, once a menacing repository of repressed fears and unacceptable impulses, has been acknowledged, embraced, and assimilated. Its raw, potent energies, previously channeled into destructive behaviors or projections, are now available for creative expression, genuine self-assertion, and profound empathy. What was once perceived as the quote 43 becomes a wellspring of vital force, grounded wisdom, and an unflinching capacity to face reality, both internal and external, without illusion. Similarly, the ego, stripped of its inflated grandiosity and defensive mechanisms, is disarmed and reoriented. No longer the self-serving master of the psyche, it transforms into a humble servant of the higher self. Its function shifts from striving for external validation and control to facilitating the authentic expression of the individual's unique essence in the world. This refined ego operates with discernment and clarity, free from the entanglements of attachment, nafs, ahamkara, and the distortions of self-deception. It becomes a tool for conscious action, aligned with universal principles of compassion and interconnectedness. The allure of power for dominance over others dissipates, replaced by a deep understanding of authentic power as an internal resource for service and creation. This shift imbues the individual with a profound resilience, enabling them to navigate life's inevitable challenges with equanimity, drawing upon an inner wellspring of strength that is no longer dependent on external circumstances or the approval of others. This integration fosters a fundamental shift in our experience of existence, moving us towards living in wholeness and unity. The illusion of separation, that foundational spiritual deception fostered by the ego and the archetype, begins to dissolve. We recognize our inherent interconnectedness with all beings and with the divine ground of existence. This recognition is not merely an intellectual concept, but a deeply felt, experiential reality. Empathy, no longer a cultivated virtue but an intrinsic aspect of our being, expands to encompass all sentient life. The suffering of others is no longer perceived as distinct or separate from our own. It becomes a shared human experience that elicits a compassionate response rather than fear, judgment, or indifference. The book's quote 44, mechanism, so central to the archetype's destructive power, loses its grip as we perceive the inherent dignity and shared humanity or sentience in all. This state of wholeness transcends the simplistic dualities of good and evil, not by negating them, but by integrating them into a more expansive understanding. We recognize that the energy previously manifested as evil is, at its root, undifferentiated potential, a raw, primal force that, when unconscious and unintegrated, can be destructive, but when brought into conscious awareness and aligned with the higher self, becomes a powerful impetus for growth, transformation, and creation. The devil archetype, in its transcended form, ceases to be an external adversary or an internal demon, becoming instead a profound teacher, a crucible through which consciousness is forged and refined. Its lessons are integrated into our being, making us wiser, more compassionate, and more capable of holding complexity without succumbing to fragmentation. Our responses to life shift from fear-based reactions, rooted in the ego's drive for survival and control, to love-based responses, characterized by generosity, understanding, and a deep commitment to the well-being of the whole. The implications of this individual transformation extend far beyond the personal realm, laying the groundwork for the transformed individual to become a potent agent of change in the world. Those who have undergone this alchemical process are uniquely positioned to address the collective shadows, systemic injustices, and pervasive conflicts that plague humanity. They do not approach the world's problems from a place of righteous anger or moral superiority, which often perpetuates the very dualities they seek to overcome. Instead, they act from a place of deep compassion, clarity, and non-attachment, understanding that collective suffering is a manifestation of unintegrated individual and collective shadows. Such individuals can hold space for difficult truths, facilitate genuine dialogue across divides, and offer pathways for healing without succumbing to the seductions of power or the pitfalls of egoic leadership. Their presence alone can be transformative, radiating a calm strength and an unwavering commitment to unity. They understand that true change begins within, and that external reforms, while necessary, are ultimately unsustainable, without a corresponding shift in consciousness. By embodying wholeness, they inspire others to embark on their own journeys of self-discovery and integration. They are the conduits through which compassion flows into action, translating spiritual principles into tangible efforts to alleviate suffering, promote justice, and foster ecological harmony. Their contributions might manifest in diverse forms, as leaders, educators, artists, healers, or simply as deeply present and compassionate members of their communities, but their impact is unified by their commitment to embodying the integrated self and fostering connection. It is crucial to emphasize that this transcendence is not a static endpoint, but rather a journey of continuous evolution and perpetual vigilance. The integrated self is not a destination achieved once and for all, but a dynamic state that requires ongoing awareness, self-reflection, and commitment. The archetypal energies, while integrated, do not vanish. They become part of a larger tapestry, requiring continuous discernment and refinement. The practice of mindfulness, self-inquiry, and selfless service remains essential, not as a means to suppress the dark, but as a way to maintain conscious alignment with the true self and prevent regression into old patterns. The wisdom gained from understanding the devil archetype serves as a perpetual reminder of the seductive power of illusion and separation, keeping us humble and vigilant. The journey is one of deepening wisdom, expanding compassion, and ever-increasing capacity to hold the paradoxes of existence without succumbing to fragmentation or fear. Ultimately, our extensive inquiry into the psychology of evil and the devil archetype serves a singular, profound purpose: reclaiming humanity's divine potential. This entire exploration is not an academic exercise in cataloguing darkness, but a courageous confrontation with the forces that obscure our inherent light. By understanding the mechanisms of deception, the allure of egoic power, and the erosion of empathy, we equip ourselves with the tools to dismantle these structures within ourselves and within the collective. The devil archetype, in its most profound teaching, forces us to look inward, to confront our own capacity for both shadow and light, and to choose consciousness over unconsciousness, unity over separation, and compassion over cruelty. This journey is a pathway to higher consciousness, spiritual liberation, and the realization of our innate wholeness. It beckons us to remember that suffering, both individual and collective, fundamentally stems from the illusion of separation. By transcending the archetype, we transcend this illusion, liberating immense creative energy and redirecting it towards building a world rooted in genuine interconnectedness and universal love. This is the hopeful vision that emerges from the depths of our inquiry, a humanity capable of transforming its greatest challenges into its greatest opportunities for evolution, guided by an awakened consciousness that recognizes the sacredness of all life and strives for a future of true peace, justice, and profound unity. The devil archetype, once perceived as the embodiment of external evil, is ultimately revealed as a mirror reflecting our own unintegrated aspects, offering us the most potent catalyst for self-knowledge and the courageous path back to our authentic, compassionate, and unified self. Having traversed the intricate pathways of individual integration and personal liberation in our previous discussions, recognizing the devil archetype as a profound mirror for self-knowledge and a catalyst for spiritual awakening, we now turn our gaze outward to the broader canvas of human experience. Our journey thus far has elucidated how the individual, through radical awareness, shadow reclamation, and ego disarming, can transcend the archetype's destructive grip. Yet, the work is far from complete, for the human psyche is not an isolated island. It is inextricably woven into the vast tapestry of collective consciousness. The insights gleaned from personal transformation, therefore, must inevitably inform and inspire a grander, more ambitious undertaking: the collective integration and transcendence of the devil archetype, a paradigm shift that holds the potential for profound societal transformation and global unity. We contend that the very mechanisms of evil, as embodied by the devil archetype, manifest not only within the individual heart but also within the collective psyche of humanity. Just as an individual possesses an unacknowledged shadow, so too do societies harbour a collective shadow, a repository of historical traumas, unaddressed injustices, systemic biases, and cultural blind spots. These collective shadows, often repressed and projected onto the other, fuel intergroup conflict, perpetrate cycles of violence, and sustain structures of oppression. Our collective ego, manifested as ethnocentrism, nationalism, ideological rigidity, and the relentless pursuit of power and dominion, mirrors the individual ego's self-centeredness and illusion of separation. Consequently, the task of confronting the devil archetype demands not only a personal reckoning, but also a collective one, a shared commitment to introspection, accountability, and systemic change. The path to collective integration begins with a radical awareness of these societal shadows. This necessitates an unflinching examination of history, a willingness to acknowledge past atrocities, colonial legacies, and systemic discrimination without defensiveness or denial. It requires critical discernment of the narratives that shape our collective identity, questioning the myths that glorify conquest or demonize entire groups of people. Just as the individual must confront their hidden biases, so too must societies engage in deep, ongoing self-reflection to uncover and understand the roots of their collective prejudices and destructive patterns. This collective awareness, however painful, is the indispensable first step towards healing and reconciliation. It is the communal act of holding up the mirror, allowing the collective devil archetype to reveal the unacknowledged darkness that festers beneath the surface of seemingly civilized societies. Following this awareness, the process of collective shadow reclamation demands active engagement with these unearthed truths. This is not merely an intellectual exercise, but a profound spiritual and ethical imperative. It involves restorative justice initiatives that seek to heal past harms, truth and reconciliation commissions that provide platforms for acknowledgement and redress, and educational reforms that present a more nuanced and inclusive account of human history. We must collectively integrate the parts of our shared past that we have disowned or repressed, recognizing that the strength of a society lies not in its ability to forget its failings, but in its capacity to learn from them, to make amends, and to build a more just and equitable future. This reclamation is the collective equivalent of integrating the personal shadow, transforming the raw energy of past transgressions into a source of wisdom, empathy, and renewed ethical commitment. Furthermore, the disarming of the collective ego, manifested as nationalistic pride, religious fundamentalism, corporate greed, and the illusion of cultural supremacy, is equally paramount. This involves fostering a global consciousness that transcends narrow self-interest and embraces the interconnectedness of all life. It means cultivating humility in our international relations, recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of every culture and individual, and dismantling the hierarchical structures that perpetuate inequality and exploitation. The collective ego, much like its individual counterpart, thrives on the illusion of separation, pitting, quote, 49, quote, against, quote, 50, quote, and justifying dominance through a distorted sense of righteousness. To disarm it, we must cultivate universal empathy, recognizing our shared humanity and the common challenges that bind us. This requires fostering dialogue across divides, promoting cross-cultural understanding, and prioritizing collaborative solutions over competitive ones. The transformative power of compassion and forgiveness, so vital for individual healing, also extends its balm to the collective sphere. Collective compassion compels us to address systemic suffering, poverty, injustice, environmental degradation, not as isolated problems, but as interconnected manifestations of an unintegrated global psyche. It demands that we extend empathy to those who have been marginalized, oppressed, or victimized by collective shadows, and work tirelessly to alleviate their plight. Collective forgiveness, on the other hand, is a complex and often protracted process. It does not mean forgetting past harms or absolving perpetrators of responsibility. Rather, it signifies a conscious decision to break cycles of vengeance and resentment, to release the grip of historical grievances, and to forge new pathways based on mutual respect and a shared commitment to peace. It is the spiritual alchemy that transmutes collective trauma into collective wisdom, paving the way for genuine reconciliation and sustainable peace. As integrated individuals emerge from their personal journeys of confronting the devil archetype, they become potent catalysts for this broader collective transformation. They embody the principles of awareness, compassion, and unity, serving as beacons of hope and models for a new way of being. Their actions, choices, and contributions, whether in leadership roles, community organizing, education, or simply through their daily interactions, ripple outward, inspiring others to embark on their own journeys of self-knowledge and social responsibility. These integrated selves understand that true power lies not in domination, but in service, not in division, but in connection, not in ignorance, but in enlightened consciousness. They become the architects of a more humane and harmonious world, demonstrating that the transcendence of the devil archetype is not an abstract philosophical ideal, but a lived reality with tangible, transformative impacts. The ultimate aim of this collective integration is the realization of a global consciousness rooted in wholeness and unity. This entails dissolving the illusion of separation not just between individuals, but between nations, cultures, religions, and even humanity and the natural world. It envisions a world where the destructive impulses of the collective shadow are understood and transformed, where the self-serving tendencies of the collective ego are disarmed, and where the inherent dignity and interconnectedness of all beings are universally recognized and honored. Such a world would prioritize peace-building over warfare, restorative justice over punitive retribution, ecological stewardship over exploitative consumption, and spiritual flourishing over material acquisition. It would be a world where the devil archetype, once a formidable force of destruction, has been fully integrated, its lessons learned, and its energy transmuted into a powerful impetus for evolution and enlightenment. This grand vision, however, is not a final destination but an ongoing journey, an eternal vigilance. The devil archetype as a dynamic interpretive tool reminds us that the potential for darkness, both individual and collective, is an ever-present aspect of the human condition. It is a constant invitation to consciousness, a perpetual challenge to remain awake, discerning, and compassionate. The work of integration is never truly finished. It requires continuous self-reflection, ongoing dialogue, and unwavering commitment to ethical action. Each generation must confront its own shadows, disarm its own egoic tendencies, and reaffirm its commitment to the principles of unity and wholeness. The archetype therefore transforms from a symbol of fear into a constant reminder of our profound capacity for growth, resilience, and spiritual evolution. In embracing this ongoing journey, we reclaim humanity's divine potential, moving beyond the simplistic dualities of good and evil to a more profound understanding of the intricate interplay between light and shadow within ourselves and our societies. The devil archetype, in its full symbolic complexity, thus serves as an eternal teacher, guiding us towards greater self-knowledge, deeper compassion, and ultimately a more integrated and harmonious collective future. It illuminates not only the depths of human depravity, but also the boundless heights of human potential for transformation, redemption, and the co-creation of a world imbued with peace, justice, and profound spiritual meaning. Our comprehensive exploration of this archetype, spanning psychological frameworks and spiritual traditions, culminates in this hopeful vision that through understanding and integrating our inner and outer devils, humanity can consciously evolve towards a state of profound unity and universal well-being. As we draw this extensive exploration to its culmination, we find ourselves standing at a precipice of profound understanding, gazing back at the labyrinthine pathways we have traversed. The journey has not merely been an intellectual exercise, but a deep dive into the very core of what it means to be human, challenging preconceived notions and demanding an unflinching gaze into both the shadows and the nascent light within. Our journey through the psychology of evil, the devil archetype, has been an arduous yet profoundly illuminating one, demanding a rigorous, often uncomfortable engagement with the darkest facets of the human condition and, paradoxically, revealing the most sublime potentials of the human spirit. It asks of us, the observers, a level of introspection that transcends mere academic curiosity, urging us into a personal reckoning. We have meticulously dissected the devil archetype not as a literal horned entity lurking in external realms, but as a dynamic interpretive tool, a potent symbolic lens through which to comprehend the myriad, often subtle, manifestations of evil, both within the individual psyche and across the vast, intricate tapestry of human civilization. This archetype, we contend, serves as a perennial, albeit often unwelcome, catalyst for profound self-knowledge and an imperative towards conscious evolution. It is a mirror, reflecting back not only our fears but also our untapped courage, presenting a silent, insistent challenge. Will you truly see what lies beneath, or will you turn away? Our initial premise established evil not as an absolute external force, but as a complex interplay of psychological deficits, such as the chilling capacity for intentional harm, the insidious erosion of empathy that allows cruelty to flourish, and the sophisticated mechanisms of moral disengagement that rationalize atrocity, and spiritual distortions, primarily the pervasive illusion of separation from the inherent unity of all existence. This illusion, we argued, is deeply rooted in ignorance and attachment, ignorance of our interconnectedness, an attachment to egoic constructs of self that prioritize individual gain over collective well-being. We then observed how the devil archetype concretizes these abstract concepts, giving them form and voice. Individually, it manifests as the unintegrated shadow, the repressed, disowned aspects of self that fester in the subconscious, often erupting in destructive ways, and the unexamined ego, with its insatiable desires and self-serving narratives. Collectively, it appears as the unaddressed wounds and projections of society, the historical traumas, systemic injustices, and collective biases that societies often refuse to acknowledge, preferring instead to project blame onto external others. The mechanisms through which this archetype operates, deception, the seductive allure of power, and the systematic gradual erosion of conscience, were revealed as the insidious architects of suffering, perpetuating cycles of harm that ripple across generations and cultures, leaving indelible scars. One might reflect, how many times have I or my community fallen prey to the subtle whispers of these very mechanisms, justifying small compromises that eventually lead to profound moral decay? Yet our inquiry was never solely focused on diagnosis, on merely identifying the pathology of evil. It was fundamentally oriented towards prognosis and transformation. We delineated a comprehensive schema for confronting this inner devil, beginning with the radical awareness born of relentless self-reflection and acute spiritual discernment. This awareness is not a gentle realization, but often a jarring awakening, a moment when the comfortable illusions begin to crumble. This newfound awareness, raw and often unsettling, paves the way for the courageous acknowledgement and reclamation of the shadow, integrating its repressed energies rather than projecting them outwards onto others, creating scapegoats. This process is arduous, demanding an honest confrontation with one's own capacity for malevolence, a willingness to embrace the uncomfortable truth that I too possess the seeds of what I condemn. Concurrently, we emphasize the ongoing lifelong process of disarming the ego, cultivating humility, empathy, and non-attachment to dismantle the self-centered constructs that perpetuate the illusion of separation. This involves a conscious choice, moment by moment, to step back from the ego's demands, to listen more than speak, to serve more than dominate. This individual journey, marked by sustained compassion and forgiveness for self and others, culminates in the emergence of an integrated self, a state of profound inner peace and authentic power that dissolves dualities, bridging the chasm between light and shadow, and fostering a profound, felt sense of unity with all life. Extending this transformative framework to the collective realm, we envisioned societies engaging in a parallel, equally challenging process, confronting their collective shadow, acknowledging historical traumas and systemic injustices that have been conveniently forgotten or willfully ignored, and disarming the collective ego, often characterized by virulent nationalism, insatiable greed, and the relentless pursuit of dominance over other nations or groups. This societal alchemy, we posited, necessitates restorative justice, a move beyond punitive measures to healing and repair, global compassion that extends beyond national borders, and collective forgiveness, releasing the grip of ancient grievances that fuel ongoing conflict. The aim is nothing less than the cultivation of a planetary consciousness rooted in unity, peace, and justice, where the well-being of the whole supersedes the perceived interests of any single part. The devil archetype, in this grand narrative, thus transcends its initial terrifying visage to become a perpetual teacher, its shadows illuminating the path towards greater light, its temptations serving as trials on the journey to spiritual maturity. It is as if the collective consciousness, in a silent dialogue with its own history, is prompted to ask, quote 56, quote, "What then is the ultimate import of this archetypal journey?" It is the profound realization that the confrontation with evil, symbolized by the devil archetype, is not a singular event to be overcome and forgotten, a battle won once and for all. Rather, it is an ongoing, dynamic process of integration and transcendence, a continuous dance between awareness and action. We are not called to eradicate the darkness, for it is an intrinsic aspect of the cosmic dance of creation, a necessary friction that catalyzes growth, much like the shadow gives definition to the form. Rather, we are called to understand its nature, to integrate its lessons, and to transmute its raw energy into consciousness, compassion, and creative power. The archetype serves as a constant, potent reminder that the potential for both profound destructiveness and boundless love resides within the human heart, and that our lives are a continuous act of choosing which of these potentials we will nourish and manifest. It is a daily, sometimes hourly referendum on our values. This ongoing vigilance is paramount, the ego's subtle whispers of self-importance, inflating our perceived worth and justifying our transgressions. The shadow's unacknowledged resentments simmering beneath the surface, poisoning our relationships. The collective's historical amnesias, conveniently forgetting past atrocities to maintain a sanitized self-image. These are the fertile grounds where the devil archetype perpetually seeks to reassert its influence. Our work, therefore, is never truly finished. It is a lifelong commitment to radical self-honesty, compassionate engagement with ourselves and others, and unwavering dedication to the principles of unity and interconnectedness. Each moment presents an opportunity to either succumb to the illusion of separation, thereby empowering the destructive forces within and without, allowing them to dictate our choices, or to consciously choose the path of integration, fostering wholeness within ourselves and contributing to the global tapestry of peace. The inner thought here is often a quiet, persistent question. Am I choosing fear, or am I choosing love? The devil archetype in its myriad forms, Mara challenging the Buddha, Iblis defying Allah, Satan tempting Christ, the Asuras battling the Devas, the trickster disrupting order, is thus not merely a symbol of malevolence, but a profound spiritual and psychological test. It challenges us to look beyond superficial appearances, to probe the depths of our motivations, asking, why do I truly act as I do? And to confront the uncomfortable truths about our own complicity in suffering, both personal and collective. It is in this confrontation that our true strength is forged, not in avoiding the darkness, but in facing it. Our compassion deepened as we recognized the shared human struggle, and our capacity for love expanded as we embraced the totality of existence. By engaging with this archetype consciously, we transform it from a source of fear and destruction into a catalyst for profound personal and planetary awakening. We learn that evil, at its core, is not an external force to be vanquished in a grand cosmic battle, but an internal imbalance, a distortion of consciousness that yearns for recognition, integration, and ultimate transformation. Ultimately, our essay posits that the highest form of human evolution lies in transcending the dualism that the devil archetype so starkly represents, the sharp division between good and evil, light and dark, self and other. It is the journey from fragmentation to wholeness, from separation to unity, from ignorance to enlightened awareness. This is not a passive process, a state to be effortlessly attained, but an active, courageous engagement with the entirety of our human experience, embracing every messy, contradictory part of ourselves and the world. It demands that we cultivate an unwavering inner compass, guided by wisdom and compassion, capable of navigating the treacherous terrain of temptation, the subtle power dynamics that permeate all relationships, and the alluring, often intoxicating, gratification of the ego. The vision we hold forth is one where humanity, individually and collectively, reclaims its inherent divine potential. This potential is not about achieving some ethereal, unattainable perfection, but about embracing our full humanity, including our capacity for shadow, and consciously choosing, with every breath and every action, to align with the forces of love, justice, and interconnectedness. The devil archetype, far from being an insurmountable obstacle, becomes the very crucible in which this transformation occurs. It challenges us to become more discerning in our judgments, more resilient in the face of adversity, more compassionate towards suffering, and ultimately more whole in our being. In conclusion, the psychology of evil, the devil archetype, serves as a timeless mirror, reflecting back to us the profound responsibility inherent in our human existence. It reminds us that every act, every thought, every choice contributes to the unfolding narrative of our individual and collective destiny. By understanding and consciously engaging with the devil archetype, we unlock the keys to our own liberation, transforming the potential for evil into an unparalleled opportunity for growth, healing, and the realization of a truly integrated, compassionate, and enlightened humanity. The journey is arduous, the path often obscured by our own fears and projections, but the promise of wholeness and unity remains our guiding star, perpetually beckoning us towards a future where the shadows are understood, integrated, and ultimately transmuted into the radiant light of conscious awareness. This is the enduring legacy and the eternal challenge that the devil archetype places before us, a challenge to rise, not above, but through our own darkness. Our journey through the labyrinthine corridors of the human psyche and spirit has led us to a profound understanding. The confrontation with the devil archetype is not a singular battle to be won, but an ongoing, dynamic process of integration and conscious becoming. We have delineated the initial stages of this transformative work: radical awareness, courageous shadow reclamation, and the continuous disarming of the ego, culminating in the emergence of an integrated self and the blueprint for collective healing. Yet, to posit this as a static endpoint would be to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of archetypal energies and the ceaseless evolution of consciousness. The devil archetype, once acknowledged and integrated, does not vanish. Rather, it transmutes into a perpetual teacher, its lessons deepening and diversifying as we progress along the path. The initial foray into these inner realms often feels like navigating a dense, fog-shrouded forest, where familiar landmarks disappear and hidden fears lurk just beyond the periphery of perception. The profound understanding that emerges is not merely intellectual, it resonates deep within the bones, a visceral knowing that the devil is not an external foe, but an internal force for integration. Radical awareness, the very first step, demands an unflinching gaze into the darkest corners of our being, a willingness to see what we have long denied. This is followed by courageous shadow reclamation, a painstaking process of retrieving disowned parts, anger, shame, unacceptable desires, and bringing them into conscious acceptance. Finally, the continuous having traversed the intricate landscapes of the devil archetype, from its conceptualization as a symbolic representation of humanity's darker potentials to its manifestations across individual and collective psyches, we arrive at a crucial understanding. The journey of integration and transcendence is not a destination but an unfolding process. It's a winding path, often obscured by internal fog, yet always leading deeper into the self. The archetype, as we have argued, serves as a perpetual teacher, its lessons subtly shifting and deepening as our consciousness expands. One might initially encounter it as a monstrous figure demanding confrontation, only to later perceive it as a subtle whisper of self-doubt or a flicker of resentment. The path of conscious becoming is, by its very nature, dynamic and ceaseless, demanding not merely a singular, heroic confrontation with a perceived external evil, but an enduring, quiet commitment to vigilance and transmutation. It asks us to constantly observe, adapt, and refine our inner world, knowing that true growth is a continuous state of becoming, not a static achievement. This perpetual vigilance does not stem from a place of paralyzing fear, but rather from a profound, almost reverent appreciation for the intricate cunning of the ego and the subtle, often insidious ways in which the unintegrated shadow can reassert its influence. It's a knowing smile, a recognition of an old trickster who, despite our best efforts, still holds a few cards up its sleeve. Even after significant breakthroughs in self-awareness and integration, those moments of profound clarity where one feels truly liberated, the archetypal energies do not vanish, they transmute. The overt expressions of malevolence or self-destruction, the loud, destructive impulses, may recede into the background, perhaps even disappearing entirely. However, the more nuanced, sophisticated forms of self-deception, The subtle attachments that bind us and the unconscious biases that colour our perceptions can persist, often hiding in plain sight. It is in these refined challenges, these almost imperceptible distortions of truth, that the devil archetype continues to serve its pedagogical function, prompting us to delve ever deeper into the substrata of our motivations and perceptions. We learn, with painstaking effort, to discern the faint whispers of egoic pride in our accomplishments, a fleeting thought of superiority that tarnishes genuine joy. The subtle judgments lurking beneath our outwardly expressed compassion, a silent critique that undermines true empathy, or the insidious pull of collective conformity masked as social harmony, a quiet surrender of personal truth for the sake of fitting in. This demands a continuous, rigorous self-inquiry, an unwavering willingness to always question our own narratives, to peel back the layers of self-justification, and to remain courageously open to uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the complex systems we inhabit. Is this truly coming from my authentic self, we might ask? Or is there a hidden agenda, a subtle fear, at play here? This internal dialogue becomes a constant companion, a quiet guardian against complacency. The integrated self, therefore, is not one devoid of shadow, a pristine, flawless entity, but rather one that has learned to engage with its shadow consciously and compassionately. It is a self that recognizes the fluidity of identity, understanding that who we are is a constant negotiation, an ongoing interplay between light and darkness, strength and vulnerability. The archetype, once perceived as an adversary to be overcome, a formidable opponent in a spiritual battle, becomes an internal compass. Its subtle re-emergence in thought or action, perhaps a sudden burst of anger or a moment of passive aggression, serves as an immediate diagnostic tool, a gentle nudge, signalling an area requiring further attention, integration, or release. It might manifest as a feeling of tightness in the chest when encountering a particular viewpoint, or a recurring dream that speaks to an unaddressed fear. This living praxis manifests as a state of fluid awareness, a heightened sensitivity to one's inner and outer landscape, where we are less reactive to external provocations and internal urges, and more capable of responding with wisdom and discernment. We no longer feel compelled to lash out in anger or immediately fulfill every desire. Instead, we pause, observe, and choose our response. Our engagement with the world becomes less about exerting control over others or situations, and more about fostering compassionate interaction, less about accumulating personal gain, and more about contributing to collective well-being. The quote 62 begins to subtly dissolve into the quote 63, not through loss, but through expansion. This profound shift in relationship with the archetype moves us beyond a simplistic dualism of good versus evil, a black and white worldview that often traps us in judgment and conflict. We begin to understand that the quote 64 is not an external entity to be vanquished, an antagonist to be defeated in some cosmic battle, but an internal potentiality, a raw, undifferentiated energy that can be directed towards either fragmentation or wholeness, destruction or creation. It embodies the very tension of opposites that is inherent to existence, the dynamic interplay of forces that gives life its vibrancy and complexity. And it is through our conscious, intentional engagement with this tension, rather than its suppression, that true spiritual alchemy occurs. The archetype in this elevated understanding symbolizes the profound capacity for human transformation, the crucible in which our baser instincts can be refined into virtues, where raw aggression might become protective strength, and our ignorance transmuted into wisdom. A deeper understanding born from humility, it represents the very edge of our comfort zone, that exhilarating yet terrifying boundary where growth is inevitable if we choose conscious engagement over the safer, yet ultimately stagnant path of avoidance. Stepping to this edge, one might feel a tremor of fear, a strong urge to retreat, but a deeper voice whispers, quote 65, quote, "The vision of a conscious humanity, cultivated through this relentless journey of self-integration, is one where individuals live in authentic power, unburdened by the heavy chains of unacknowledged fear, shame, or resentment. Imagine a person whose movements are light, whose gaze is clear because they carry no hidden burdens. They embody clarity of purpose, a deep and unshakable connection to their inner wisdom, and an expansive capacity for love and compassion that extends effortlessly beyond personal boundaries." Their actions flow from a place of genuine integrity, recognizing the profound interconnectedness of all life, understanding that harm to one is harm to all. This individual transformation naturally extends to the collective. Societies in turn begin to reflect these integrated values, transitioning from structures built on fear, scarcity, and ruthless competition to those founded on universal empathy, restorative justice, and profound ecological stewardship. The collective shadow, the historical traumas, systemic injustices, and inherited biases that have plagued generations, is no longer suppressed or projected onto scapegoats, but is actively engaged with through courageous truth-telling, meaningful reparations, and systemic reforms designed to heal and uplift. The collective ego, manifested as rampant nationalism, rigid ideological dogma, or insatiable corporate greed, is consciously transcended through global cooperation, shared humanitarian values, and recognition of our common destiny on this fragile planet. It is a vision of humanity acting as a single, unified organism, each part contributing to the health of the whole. In this transformed landscape, the experience of suffering itself undergoes a profound reinterpretation. What was once perceived solely as a consequence of the archetype's destructive influence, a curse, a punishment, an unbearable weight, now becomes a potent teacher, a catalyst for refining consciousness and deepening compassion. The searing pain of separation, the anguish of injustice witnessed or endured, or the despair of profound personal loss, when met with awareness and a resolute commitment to integration, can become pathways to profound empathy and spiritual awakening. How can I learn from this, one might ask through tears? What truth is this pain revealing? The archetype, as a symbol of suffering and its origins in ignorance and attachment, thus transmutes into a symbol of awakening, guiding us through the very challenges it represents towards a deeper understanding of liberation. It is through witnessing and confronting the depths of human cruelty, the darkest corners of what humanity is capable of, and the subtle machinations of ego that perpetuate it, that we are impelled, almost by an undeniable inner force, to cultivate the antithetical virtues of kindness, humility, and selfless service. The darkness, in its stark contrast, illuminates the path to light. Ultimately, the journey with the devil archetype is about embracing the dynamic dance of light and shadow, understanding that true wholeness does not necessitate the eradication of darkness, but rather its integration and conscious transmutation. It's not about becoming perfectly, quote, 68, quote, but authentically whole. The shadow, once a repository of repressed fears, unacknowledged wounds, and forbidden impulses, becomes a source of vital energy and creative potential when acknowledged, understood, and brought into the light of consciousness. Imagine the surge of creative power released when long-held shame is finally seen and accepted. The ego, once a master of self-deception and division, fiercely protecting its constructed identity, becomes a humble servant to the authentic self, providing essential structure and agency without dictating purpose. Its role shifts from controlling master to loyal steward. The quote 69 in its most profound symbolic iteration is the crucible in which the gold of consciousness is refined, the intense heat and pressure burning away impurities and revealing true value. It is the tension that forges resilience, strengthening our spirit through challenge, and it is the mirror that reveals our deepest truths, reflecting back not just what we wish to see, but what we are. It is the necessary counterpoint that illuminates the path to ultimate freedom, for without the darkness, how would we ever truly recognize the light? Our exploration concludes with an unwavering message of hope and empowerment, a resounding affirmation of humanity's inherent strength. Humanity possesses an innate, profound capacity to consciously choose, to transform, and to co-create a reality rooted in unity, compassion, and love. The insights gleaned from centuries of clinical psychology, the deepest wisdom of spiritual traditions across cultures, and the archetypal lens of the devil converge upon this singular, undeniable truth. The power to transcend the destructive forces, both within the labyrinth of our own minds and in the external world, resides within each individual and within the collective will. This transformative path, while undeniably arduous and demanding perpetual vigilance, offers the ultimate reward of profound liberation. A liberation not from the challenges of existence itself, for life will always present its trials, but from the illusion of separation and the suffering it engenders. It is a liberation of the spirit, a freedom that resonates deep within the soul. We are called then to continuously engage with our inner landscapes, to courageously confront the shadows that emerge from the depths of our psyche, and to lovingly yet firmly disarm the egoic structures that seek to divide us from ourselves and from others. We are invited to cultivate a global consciousness that transcends tribalism and embraces our shared humanity, recognizing the universal spark within every being. The devil archetype, in its enduring symbolic power, stands as a testament to the ongoing work of conscious evolution, a constant, potent reminder that the choice between fragmentation and wholeness, between ignorance and enlightenment, rests perpetually in our hands, in every decision, every thought, every action. May we choose wisely, with open hearts that feel deeply and discerning minds that see clearly, to continually transmute darkness into light, fear into love, and separation into the profound unity that is our true inheritance. This is the ultimate reclamation of our divine potential, the ongoing symphony of conscious becoming, played out in the grand theatre of human existence.